Well, here we are again, Justice for All for the next couple of hours. I'm George Yates. How are you doing out there, ladies and gentlemen? It's kind of a sunny day. It's warming up a little bit. It's supposed to really warm up again tomorrow. It's supposed to be 63 degrees, so maybe improve this situation a little bit. It's been cold out there, man. But anyway, here we are on Justice for All, or as my producer likes to say, Justice for Y'all. Before we get started today, I wanted to express, we lost one of our, my show here lost its biggest fan. My oldest brother, Eric, died, passed away a couple of weeks ago now, and he was my biggest fan of the show. He never missed a show. He would always want to listen in on Saturdays, and then I'd always give him a call afterwards and see if he liked the show, and he was a big listener, so... We buried him out there at that Albert Horton Memorial Cemetery, that beautiful new veteran cemetery out in Suffolk, a couple of weeks ago. So I think I missed the show that day, and I was on last week, but haven't expressed my condolences to the rest of our family for the loss of my brother. And anyway, he'll definitely be missed. I miss him every day at the end of the show because I can't call him on the phone and say, how'd you like the show? But hope he's resting easy up there. So anyway, here we are, Justice for All. Looking forward to today's show. We have a great guest today. She is the author of a new book that's just out on Amazon. It's called Caught, The Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics. Her name is Marie Gottschalk. She's a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, has been there since 1997, has a Ph.D. from Yale and a history degree from Cornell, and has written another book prior to this one, also on the prison system in America called Prison and the Gallows. So we would like to welcome her to the show today. Marie Gottschalk, how you doing, Professor?
Thank you, George. Thanks for having me here, and my condolences about your brother.
Yeah, he was always gave me a lot of good positive feedback after the show. So, anyway, well, I've had a chance to read your book, and it's as someone who's kind of been in the trenches. I'm practicing law, a lot of criminal law for the last 30 years. I recall very well back in the day there was parole. I remember locking somebody up. I remember if I prosecuted somebody and they got a 20-year sentence, they were eligible for parole in about 4 years, 4 or 5. And then around 1996 here in Virginia, we abolished parole. So now if you get a 20-year sentence, you're going to do, I guess, about 85% of that. And your book talks about 4 decades now of mass incarceration, where the prison's population has just continued to go up and up and up and up over the last several decades. And that's a very timely issue because now it's in the press. There was a New York Times article on it this week. So how did you become, I guess more in general terms, you've written 2 books on the prison system. You're a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania. How did you get started in this whole process of studying the penal system in the first place?
That's a good question. It was a circuitous route. I had finished an earlier book on health policy in the United States, and I frankly had nothing new to say on health policy. And I did the thing which you shouldn't do as a junior faculty member, which was to write a book on a completely different topic than your original research. And just as I was finishing up the other book, I was it was called to serve on a jury or a jury pool down here in Philadelphia and listen to everyone for a couple of days talk about the system. And I had been collecting a lot of clips about mass incarceration. This was about 2000, and it was extraordinary development to me that we had the highest incarceration rate in the world, and an incarceration rate that's 5 to 12 times that of other developed countries. And I thought this was a huge political phenomenon that wasn't being studied at all. And I decided to write a book about it.
Now,
and that was The Prison and the Gallows.
Yeah, and when did that book come out?
That came out in 2006.
And the original impetus for this book, I think that you mentioned this in your foreword, that you really weren't intending to write another book, but as you got started doing some research, you ended up with a whole other book. How did that happen?
Right. I thought I didn't have a lot new to say about it, and then I was asked to talk about a number of issues related to mass incarceration, and as I began to give talks on the Prison and Gallows book and follow what was going on, I became more interested in the question of how mass incarceration is a problem that relates to the broader pathologies in American politics today. So I like to think I haven't written a second book on mass incarceration, but rather it's a broader book on, as I say in the subtitle, the lockdown of American politics and this incredible gap between the problems that the country faces and our inability to address those problems. And I consider mass incarceration one of the foremost of those problems.
Well, boy, isn't that true? It seems like our Congress and president can't seem to work together on anything. But it's a very complex issue. I guess I'm going to go ahead and let you lay it out. What is the problem? It's multifaceted, obviously. But
right.
Where do you see in general the biggest problem that makes you want to write a book about this subject?
Well, what does it mean when you have a democracy and 1 out of 30 adults is serving time somehow under the control of the system, and that compared to other countries and compared to historically, we never have had so many people under state surveillance before. And what's interesting to me in the book is I talk, 10 years ago you could talk about mass incarceration. Now increasingly we're talking about something we call the carceral state, which is, it's not just about the 2.3 million people in prison and jail, but it's the millions more people who are on parole, probation, community supervision. And then it's also about how having such a large penal system and criminal justice system and how it's impacting so many communities, so many families, and even the quality of our democracy, that you begin to talk about having this kind of carceral state, that we have millions of people now who, even if they're not in prison, they're kind of in this, what I call this never-never land between full citizenship and being incarcerated. And so I try to look at in the book how this carceral state is kind of metastasizing in American society and affecting the quality of our democratic institutions, our economic institutions, our social institutions.
Well, is it leading to less crime? I mean, we are locking a lot of people up. We abolished parole in both the state and the federal systems. And crime has gone down. I mean, I noticed that violent crime rates continue to go down year over year over year. So isn't locking a lot of people up doing something to keep the rest of the people safe?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that's the preeminent starting point for this question. And let me make a couple of points about that. First, if you look at other countries, developed countries, other advanced industrialized countries, their crime rates have gone up and down almost in sync with the United States. They start from a lower base, so overall they have a lower rate of crime, but they went up in the 60s and 70s, they came down in the early 80s, they went up again in the late 80s, early 90s, and then they have experienced this drop that we have experienced since about the early to mid-90s. So the question is, we've had this up and down in very similar tracks, especially if you map it with Canada, and yet these other countries have not incarcerated so many people. The second point to make is I think it's very important to think about the latest research on this subject. And the National Academies of Science has released a project. I was a member of that committee, and we just released a project about 21 leading scholars in this area. We've been working on this project for a couple of years, and one of the takeaway conclusions from that study is that the increase in incarceration may have caused a decrease in crime, but the magnitude is highly uncertain, and the results of most of the studies we looked at was that the magnitude was unlikely to be large. So locking up so many people actually didn't have a major impact on reducing the crime rate, that there were other factors that explain this reduction in the crime rate.
Well, it's interesting. I was just at a seminar a couple of weeks back, and there was a fellow on the dais that was talking about the fact that lead is no longer as big of an issue, and he seems to think that the fact that we took lead out of the gasoline and we've tried to clean up some of these projects that had lead in the paint and so on, and so we have fewer people or fewer young kids, especially lower socioeconomic kids. And that's the main reason why there's less violent crime today is because there's less lead in people's brains.
Right.
And then you've got the Rudy Giuliani crowd, that said that, the broken windows idea, that in New York they cleaned up the graffiti and so on and stopped crime that way. So locking up millions of people is just not doing it, in your opinion, and that's what the research shows.
Well, let me be clear about it. It's not just my opinion, right? We're talking about leading scholars in this area, and I think having the imprimatur of the National Academy of Sciences saying that the effect was very modest. And, you have to think about, you say, the logical thing is, okay, if I lock up all these people, they're not out on the street committing crime, right? So therefore, this must have caused a decrease in incarceration. But what we know is that as you incarcerate more people, one of the things is you incarcerate more marginal offenders. So when you're initially incarcerating people, you might be incarcerating people who commit, 100, 200, 300 crimes a year. But as you expand your dragnet, you're actually incarcerating people who have likely, may have only committed 2 or 3 crimes a year or even less, right? So you're going to have less of a bang for your buck by incarcerating them. We also know that longer sentences don't reduce the amount of crime that people commit, that in fact that they are not a deterrence to people committing crime. We also know that in the case of the war on drugs, that there's a huge replacement effect. You pick up a whole bunch of people on the street corner, and anybody who watches The Wire knows this, and a couple of hours later there'll be a whole bunch of other people on the street corner replacing them. We also have some indication that sending many people to prison may actually make them more criminogenic. It's sort of like my students come to the University of Pennsylvania. They come to learn from people like me, but they also come to network. And people go inside local jails and prisons, and they have opportunities to network with people that they didn't have before. And they can network on criminal activities in a way that they didn't have those opportunities before. So there are many reasons why intuitively you would think you lock people up, it's going to reduce crime, but in fact it may not. And what we are seeing is that taking so many young people, particularly young men, out of communities at the prime of their lives, they're in their 20s and they're in their 30s, and you're taking many of these young men who are fathers, brothers, uncles, and can be stabilizing forces in community, and removing them from those communities also helps to destabilize those communities and make them potentially more criminogenic.
Well, I don't understand it, quite honestly. I see that if you go into a federal court, you have a sentencing scheme. It's based upon the federal statute 3553B, right. and the judges are supposed to take into account, and it's by statute, and they have to take into account punishment for the crime in order to send a deterrent to the rest of the community. There's retribution. There's need, I guess, for society's revenge on the person who's committed this crime. There's rehabilitation, to actually try to rehabilitate the person so that they don't commit crimes again, and of course the actual defendant himself and how we're going to the needs of that particular defendant. And in my experience in the last 20 years or so, and in almost every courtroom that I'm walking into lately, the needs of the defendant are very not seem to be ignored. The needs of the it's all about retribution and punishment. And what you're saying is that as soon as you've taken this little young dope dealer off the street and you've thrown him into prison, and the judge is locking them up for many, many years, and ostensibly because it's punishment and it's supposed to be sending a deterrent. Well, it's not a deterrent at all. The guy that goes right back out to replace him on the street just says, well, I'm just not going to get caught. And so the problem with it is you can lock this young man up for 10 years on these mandatory minimum sentences. when in fact it's just ridiculous. That's way too much time to punish him, and it's not that deterrent is not going to make any difference. These child pornographers, for instance, somebody that goes out there doesn't commit any other crime. They're looking at pictures, and they're reprehensible, but this person is going to go to prison for 5, 6, 7 years, sometimes more, for a crime where he was basically just looking at a photo that he didn't even produce himself. And that's not going to deter the person that might want to look at those types of photos again. And that person, once he's caught, is not ever going to do it again. So the only you're not locking him up to save society. You know, a lot of, in my view, when you're looking at these things, and I suppose that I'm actually, you know, we're all, you know, singing off the same choir book here, because you're supposed to be protecting society when you lock people up. And there are way too many people, in my opinion, that I see getting locked up for long, long periods of time that are not going to even commit that same crime again. They've learned the lesson by the time they're standing in front of the judge at sentencing. To lock them up for, you could go give that person 6 months, and you know, that would be enough deterrent. And yet they'll get 6 and 16 years, and it's just out of hand. And so, I think that we're both in agreement on that. How did we get to this state, Professor? How in the world did we get to the point where we are locking people up forever when we don't need to?
All right, that's a good question. Very, very good question. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about politics. And we decided to demonize a certain group of people in society in part, we were able to do it. Criminals or people who've committed crime aren't popular anywhere in the world. And if you do public opinion surveys, it doesn't show that Americans are so much more punitive than people in other countries. The difference is that we have more opportunities to act on our punitiveness and act on our vindictiveness. And if you look in other countries, judges are not elected, prosecutors are not elected, that they are insulated from that kind of vindictiveness, and that there's the idea that somebody should stand between the victim of a crime or the victim's family and the punishment for that crime. Because in many cases, if you leave it up to a victim, as was done centuries ago, it'll be an eye for an eye kind of justice. And one of the evolutions of a country developing is to say you create a criminal justice system, and it's not about different families or tribes or clans wreaking vengeance on one another. But in the U.S. case, we have elected judges and we have elected prosecutors, and so that it's possible to have that impact of retribution felt much more strongly in this kind of penal populism that under certain circumstances politicians are willing to whip up. The other piece of it, which we haven't mentioned at all, is that many of these people who are locked up are African American, are Hispanic, are from disadvantaged, marginalized groups in American society, and a war on crime became a convenient way to respond to the civil rights movement and to say, you know, we're going against law and order. We're not going against African Americans, which was fashionable to say, you know, 100 years ago. But we're saying we're fighting law and order. But there were very racially charged words or racially coded words that, in fact, you could argue this was a way to solidify a certain political base by demonizing African Americans and targeting African Americans in this kind of war on crime or this quest for law and order.
Well, this it certainly has changed the political landscape, hasn't it? Because if you've got a lot of people that are convicted of felonies, they can no longer vote, and a lot of them might vote one way or the other for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. How is that? Has the conviction of felons changed the political landscape in that manner because they can't vote?
It's a good question. This is one of the things I say about how it's metastasizing into American society. There are two scholars, Christopher Ugin and Jeff Manza, who ran the numbers on the 2000 presidential election, and they argue that if former felons had been permitted to vote in Florida and looking at the rate at which they would vote and projecting who they likely would have voted for, that Al Gore would have handily won the Florida contest, and then this case never would have gone to the Supreme Court, and Al Gore would have been president rather than George W. Bush. Now, as another scholar, Tracy Birch, has kind of question some of their analysis. But overall, what Ugin and Manza are arguing is that there are a number of pivotal races, some governor's races, Senate races, that because former felons are not permitted to vote, have had a different outcome. I think the other piece of it is that former felons now are politically demobilized because of the restrictions that parole places on them. So that you say, well, we've got this big development of mass incarceration. The people most affected by it are the people who serve time and their families. But many of them come out with very strict regulations. You can't carry a cell phone. You can't have contact with other former felons. You can't leave the city or certain neighborhoods without permission from your parole officer. It becomes very difficult to politically mobilize under those circumstances. And so you have this huge population, hundreds of thousands of people who are coming out of the system every year, and you would think that there should be some kind of political mobilization around that, and yet there are these restrictions, both in terms of voting, but also in terms of these other restrictions that make it very difficult.
If you've just joined us, this is K-Talk Radio, 1650 AM. This is Justice for All, and I'm George Yates. And we've been here with Marie Gottschalk. She's a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's just written a book, Caught, which is a book about the prison state and the lockdown of American politics. And she's been with us for the last 30 minutes. This is Justice for All. We're going to take a short break here. And when we come back, we're going to get a little bit into the racial aspects of the fact that we seem to have so many blacks and Hispanics in our prison system today, Professor. And when we come back, I'd like you to talk about how you think that has happened. So we'll be right back.
The place people look to for their holiday light needs is Inter-Ray Outdoor Lights. Let the professionals at Inter-Ray decorate the exterior of your home and business without you lifting a hand. Get $100 off a $1,000 purchase. Call 355-5276 and log on to interray.com. Light up your home or business this holiday season with Inter-Ray. Call 355-5276 today. The place for authentic Indian food is the India Palace. They feature authentic Indian cuisine, have a party hall, and do catering and banquets. Open daily for lunch and dinner, they feature an excellent lunch buffet at their 2 establishments. Visit the 2 locations, 1437 Sam's Drive in Chesapeake off Battlefield and 5600 Virginia Beach Boulevard. Online, IndiaPalaceVB.com. On Facebook, look for India Palace Virginia Beach and India Palace Bar and Grill. Call 410-1183 for the India Palace.
The restaurant we've all been waiting for is here. Introducing Ipan Mano Kitchen. Critically acclaimed chef Silva Sennett and his culinary team specialize in new American Asian cuisine. The very best in Chinese, Japanese, Thai food with an American flair. Open daily for lunch and dinner, Ipan Mano Kitchen is located inside the Patrick Henry Mall in Newport News. Call 249-0033 and log on to ipanmanokitchen.com. Find them on Twitter at Ipan Mano.
If finances are holding you back from enrolling your kids or grandkids in private Christian schools this fall, call the radio station at 488-1010. We have a partnership program with several schools on the peninsula and the south side that allows us to offer a 35% discount off tuition for preschool through the 12th grade. Give us a call today at 488-1010 or visit our website at tuitionsolution.org.
RM Designs T-shirt printing and more is located in Smithfield, but serves all of Hampton Roads. They specialize in vinyl design shirts, apparel, window stickers, cups, and other specialty gifts. They also have rhinestone and embroidery designed apparel, and they offer Pandora-style beads and hardware to create a one-of-a-kind piece of jewelry. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more caters to businesses, sports teams, churches, groups, and family reunions. They also offer a great fundraising package should you be in need of money for a special project. And they also do home parties if you and your friends would like to get together and make your own creations. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more can be reached at 757-255-9140. That's 757-255-9140. Email them at rmdesigns11@aol.com or find them on Facebook at RM Twisted Designs. You can also place orders directly off their store at storeenvy.com/RM Twisted Designs.
CBS News Update. Entertainment.
Okay, we're back. It's Justice for All. I'm George Yates, and we're here with Professor Gottschalk talking about her book, Caught. You said we're talking about race, and we're also talking about the politics of our penal system. What are you just saying that it's good political? That's how people get elected, is by just fighting crime and saying longer sentences. Is that what you're saying? Is basically the cause of it is politically?
There are many factors, but that is one of the key factors.
Because I know George Allen was the governor of Virginia during the time that we abolished parole here in Virginia. It was a big political thing for him. I'm running for governor. I'm going to abolish parole. At least that was his goal, and he in fact did it. And it's easy for politicians to say we're going to run on an anti-crime platform, or we're going to do this, longer sentences, because people fear crime. And so that's good politics. And why shouldn't it be?
Right. Well, people fear crime when politicians tell them to fear crime. If you actually look at public opinion polls over the last few decades, everybody thinks that crime was a leading issue, but crime, it actually tracks when politicians begin to talk about crime as being a major issue. So in 1993-94, when they were pushing the major crime bill under Clinton, then you see crime leading in many public opinion polls. But it's often because leaders decide to make crime an issue and to play on fears of crime that crime then becomes a leading issue. But if you look at the polls, it's not like it's been sitting there at the number one or number two or number three issue during these 4 decades that we've had of mass incarceration. So I would say that the politicians have been leading the public rather than this kind of fear of crime that's just out there all the time.
And the press just goes along. I mean, how come it is that that violent crime has been going down year over year over year, and that's not a big thing? Nobody wants to talk about that. I went to this seminar, and here I am, a criminal defense attorney, and I don't think that's you don't see that in the paper very much. You're not going to see that reported on Fox News. You're not going to see that reported on MSNBC that crime is down, and why is that? And
right.
And yet they'll if the crime is up, they'll want to talk about it. But if crime is down, they're not going to. Why is that?
There's some sense that there's a kind of broken thermometer, that crime goes down, but public opinion and reporting on it lags behind. And there certainly have been reports about the great crime drop, but they're not going to be banner headlines in the newspaper. Though my sense is that finally, about 2 decades in, or a decade and a half now into the great crime drop, that there is a sense from the general public that crime is down.
Well, now, your book does talk quite a bit about the racial disparities, and I just know anecdotally, as a criminal defense attorney, I'll be down at the courthouse, let's say, and I have a client in the lockup, and I'm waiting to have his case heard, whether I'm in circuit court or in general district court, and I'll go back in. The bailiffs will let me back in to talk to my client, and they're behind a big old metal door. They're in one room. They're all locked up, a bunch of them in their orange suits, and I'll look in that room and I will see 10, 12 men in there, and 10 of them, maybe 11 of them are African American. There might be the one white guy in there, and it's something that it's been mind-boggling to me for quite some time that there's such an enormous disparity between the number of white and black people that are locked up in these jail cells. And your book talks about that quite a bit. How do you? What is the research on this? I noticed that from the 1930s through the 1980s, the population of the prisons was mostly white, and since the 1980, it has now become mostly black and Latino. Mm-hmm. What does your research show as the reason for that?
That's a very, very good question. I think it's important, and this is where I disagree with a little bit with Michelle Alexander's book on the new Jim Crow, is that I think we have to be careful not to pose mass incarceration as a kind of black-white issue, and that this is primarily an issue of too many African Americans being locked up. If you actually look at incarceration rates, if you leave aside blacks and just look at the white incarceration rate, it's about 400 per 100,000. That's about, if you look at the high end of Europe, that is still about 2 to 3 times what the high end of Europe is locking people up. So we have a mass incarceration problem even for whites. We're locking up a lot of whites. It only looks like it's not a white issue because when we compare it to blacks, the incarceration rate for blacks is about 23 per 100,000. So it looks, 400 compared to 23. Wow, we're locking up far fewer whites than we are proportional terms than blacks. But compared to other countries, we're locking up a lot of whites. And some of our very white states like Idaho, states like Wyoming, have huge very high incarceration rates, and many of those people who are being locked up are white. And what we're seeing is that the increase in incarceration is spreading to white communities, to poor whites, to the crack cocaine scare that we had in the 80s has morphed into a meth scare in many rural communities, that all these communities are facing a kind of Breaking Bad existence. So I'm resistant to seeing this or framing this as just an African American issue. And I think if we want to think about the broader politics of this and how you create coalitions to challenge it, it has to be conceived as a much wider issue. If you look at, you mentioned child pornography and sex offenses, that many of those are white people. They're mostly middle-aged white men who are being picked up by the feds for child pornography cases. And as I talk about in my book, the criminalization of immigration policy is largely feeding Hispanics into the criminal justice system. And so these are kind of ways that I think we need to make it a more complex story.
Your book mentions high school dropouts, that if you are a white high school dropout, your chances of going to prison before you're 34 or something like that is 1 in 3?
Yeah, I mean, and 1 in 3 is very high. If you're black, it's like 2 in 3. Yeah. But 1 in 3 is still very, very high. And it only looks low when you compare it for blacks at 2 in 3.
Well, that's extraordinary. Now, what do you account for that? You mean people that drop out of high school are just more inclined to commit crime than someone that finishes high school and goes to college? Or they're just treated badly, or they're just treated more badly by the system, or maybe a little bit of both?
Right. I mean, what we need to fundamentally look at is we're picking up a lot of people and putting them in the system in ways that we didn't do before, right? So we might have a cop out on the street, see somebody shove somebody else, doesn't go file an assault a charge against that person. And we also didn't have the war on drugs. The war on drugs initially was targeting African Americans much more than whites, but it's spreading out. It's spreading out to whites as well, though still blacks are disproportionately targeted by the war on drugs. And we have to think about the larger issues of which areas in the country do we heavily police. And we heavily police the poorer areas, the areas where society feels more threatened because people don't have jobs, people don't have opportunities. And if you have more police, you're going to have more people who are going to be picked up and funneled into the system. So we've got very poor white areas of Philadelphia that are churning a lot of poor white dropouts into the system. We're churning more African Americans into the system in Philadelphia, but we also are churning, poor whites into the system.
Well, to what extent is the war on drugs responsible for this increase? Is that the primary driving force behind?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I wish I could say it was the war on drugs, and we can just dial down the war on drugs, and this problem is going to go away. And one of the issues that Michelle Alexander emphasizes in her book is mass incarceration being primarily generated by the war on drugs. And if you could take every drug offender out of prison right now, every person who's in state prison primarily for a drug offense, we would only cut the prison population by 20%. And many of those drug offenders have they're primarily in there for a drug offense, but they may have some other kind of offense in their past record. So we've created this idea that mass incarceration is primarily drug offenders who are selling for, personal use, et cetera, and if we just get rid of the war on drugs, we're going to get rid of the problem of mass incarceration. I think where the war on drugs is more significant is that the tactics that are used in the war on drugs migrate to other parts of the system. So the kind of SWAT teams that we've had to fight the war on drugs are now used regularly, to serve people warrants and to pursue other crimes. And the increased militarization that we see of the police that was in part spurred by the war on drugs, and now it migrates over to, stamping down civil unrest in Ferguson and things like that. But it's created a kind of distorted idea that mass incarceration is mostly these kind of nonviolent drug offenders. The really difficult issue is that the politics of it now is that, okay, let's focus on ending the war on drugs, reducing the number of so-called nonviolent, non-sexual, non-serious offenders in prison so that we can throw the book at the really bad guys, the guys who are really committing awful crimes that nobody wants out on the street. The harder issue is that we've already been throwing the book at those people. We have a massive number of people who are in with life sentences, who are in with life without the possibility of parole. We've gotten rid of ideas of executive clemency for people that was a routine way of releasing people before. And we've had an extraordinary lengthening of sentences for things like robbery, assault, homicide. And so that if you want to reduce mass incarceration, you have to have sentencing reform, and it has to be sentencing reform not only directed at drug offenders, but at people who've committed more serious crimes.
But isn't it true, though, that so let's just break this down so I can, because I think we, in order to look at the problem, we say, okay, 20% you're saying of the population.
In state prisons, yeah.
In state prisons. What about federal?
Federal prisons are different. So federal prisons, about 50%, give or take, are there in there for the war on drugs.
Okay, so half.
Right.
So how many? Well, that would be significant then if every single one of those got out. That would be quite amazing. That would be half of all federal prisoners then.
Right.
So
but again, the way that the feds are writing a number of the reforms now is that they're presenting a lot of conditions, right? That if you have any violent incident in your past, right, on your record, even though you're in for a drug crime, you may not qualify for these other reductions. Or if you were carrying a gun at the time, even though you didn't use the gun, right? So that this idea that all of those 50% are people who are pure drug possession cases who might be selling to support their own habit, that's not exactly accurate picture of that 50%.
I know, but the fact is that many of these drug offenders are not just selling for personal use. They are businessmen, and it's an illegal trade, and they are carrying weapons, and they're not afraid to use them, and they'll use them on other people in order to protect their turf. They're violent, and they're using and so they are dangerous, and they probably should be locked up, because if they just get right back out, they're going to go right back to what they were doing again and using weapons again. So how in the world can we justify letting them out?
Well, all those 50%, then they're not drug offenders, right? They're not in for drug offenses. Then they're in for violent offenses.
Right.
So the question is, looking at them case by case, what their record is, what their past is, and what we know is that people age out of crime.
Well,
I say this to my students. If you look at the demographics just based on age, and you take all the men who are serving life sentences in the Philadelphia state prison system now, who are in their 50s, and you take my students who are in their late teens and early 20s, demographically, my students, leaving aside class issues, are more likely to be criminogenic than the men who have committed life sentences, are serving life sentences and are now in their 50s in prison. So that we forget that, people committed these crimes, but they age out of these crimes. And the other thing we forget is many of the people, even people who've committed what we consider the most serious crimes like homicide, there's a saying behind the walls, one then done. that many of these are crimes of passion. People are not going to commit them again. Some of these people are mentally ill. Some were under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time. Does it justify throwing away that life forever based on that one incident?
Right. And you bring up two very important points. That's something I've noticed for years, the aging out process. I mean, when you're out here in the trenches doing what I've been doing for the last 30 years and defending mostly young men, and there is a dynamic going on. I don't know if it's the young brain, the hormones going on in the brain from that period of time, young men between 15 and 25, let's say,
right.
And they get to be in their late 20s, 28, 29. Now, some of them retain their violent characteristics for quite some time, well into their 30s even. But that whole impetuousness that comes from being 15, 18, 21, 23 starts to fade after a young man gets into his late 20s. You don't see that as much. I mean, and as you say, they've aged out. Certainly by the time they're in their 30s and 40s, they no longer have that violent streak in them or that angry streak in them, and yet they're still doing time. And how often is that used, that aging out? I've been unsuccessful with that in my experience trying in court. I mean, my very first murder case I ever prosecuted, the victim's father even said that. It was a young man who had killed his son even. And when he got the 20-year sentence, and I told him about what parole was, and back in those days, you would probably serve half of your sentence, even though you were eligible sooner than that. So he was about 21 at the time. And even the father of the victim said, well, by the time he's 31 years old, he probably won't have that urge anymore. Even he was philosophical about the fact that if he did 10 years, then, by the time he got out, he would no longer be violent. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. But I don't think that is – they don't apply that anymore in the system, do they, that they've aged out?
Well, with mandatory minimums, right? And with sentencing guidelines,
exactly,
they don't pay, right? You don't have much choice.
No.
And so when we ask for sentencing reform, people want to make this political argument. You have to say, okay, if you want to protect public safety, what's public safety payback are you getting by keeping somebody in the state prison here in Pennsylvania? I see these men; they're walking around. Carrying IVs and having walkers, right? I mean, they can barely get some of them down the halls of the prison unassisted. What public safety payback is that? And on top of that, how is that merciful to keep these men behind bars for so many decades?
Well, isn't it about retribution? Don't we have a need in society today that if somebody kills somebody, then a lot of people would think, well, there ought to be a death penalty for it. And if not, then it ought to be life, and that's it. I mean, isn't that what happens?
Retribution is culturally constructed. What we think of as necessary at a moment in time, how much retribution is enough? If you go back to the age of the Revolution, right, we had our founding fathers debating the death penalty. We had people like Thomas Jefferson saying, well, certain crimes, you not only have to kill somebody, but you have to, mangle their bodies and hang their bodies out for public viewing and cut their guts open because that crime is so heinous, we have to do that. Well, we say we don't do that anymore. We don't need that for retribution. We now say if we have an execution, it used to be retribution meant this should be in the public square. We don't do that anymore. It's done behind closed doors in a supposedly clinical, supposedly painless way. So we modify as a society and a culture what we think is necessary to express our disgust or unhappiness or a need to be retributive to a criminal. And so the question is, if you're thinking about political reform, what's enough of punishment? What's enough of retribution? And one of the problems with life sentences is that it increases the tariff for all sentences. So if somebody's looking at a life sentence and we say, well, we'll give them 30 years, then 30 years looks like a merciful sentence, because we have this very high tariff, where in most European countries, a life sentence typically means, 12 to 15 years. And if you've kept your head low, you've stayed out of trouble, you're not likely to go out and kill a bunch of people more people, then you're going to be let out. And that used to be our system.
If you've just joined us, we're here with Professor Marie Gottschalk. She's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an expert on the American penal system, and her book is called Caught, The Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics. It's available on Amazon right now, and the book just came out, I think, last week. Is that right, Professor?
That's correct.
And it's really a fascinating book, and she's done some really extensive research in this whole area. The other thing that you talked about was the one then done. You mean if somebody kills somebody, they're not likely to go kill somebody else, and so we shouldn't punish them as severely? I mean,
well,
just because
right.
Doesn't the victim's family require that person get locked up for life?
It's funny about victims. We don't have a whole lot of research on what victims want, and we have this idea that victims get closure by killing the perpetrator or by having the perpetrator locked up for a long period of time. In other countries, support for victims has gone in a different way, and it's gone in, okay, this person was the sole provider for the family. Can we provide welfare support? Can we provide income support? Can we provide employment? Can we provide health care? And what we're seeing in other countries is that many victims, those are the things that they need. And that, in fact, this idea that you get closure by harshly punishing someone else, we haven't really proven that's in fact true. And we have cases here in Pennsylvania where we have the largest population of juveniles who are serving life sentences, people who committed their crimes 18 or under and are now serving life sentences. And we have, as you talked about the incident earlier, we have examples of people who would like the perpetrator released, that they have forgiven them for this, killing, crime of passion, 16-year-old boy killing 15-year-old girl, 25 years ago, and the mother and father are saying he should be released, and we're not releasing that person.
Well, don't these long sentences do provide some kind of deterrent? Let's say you've got a woman that kills her husband and her children. Okay, I mean, let's take the most heinous crime you can think of. She's obviously not going to commit that crime again. There's no one else to kill. What are you going to say? You can't lock her up now because she's one and done. What's the solution there when you're trying to send a message to society that you just can't? I mean, society needs to have a lengthy sentence, right? Or what?
Why? Well, I mean, what is a lengthy sentence? So a lengthy sentence,
I mean, most people would say
30
life.
Years ago, well, they used to say life, but 30 years ago, people said 10 years. That was acceptable. That you didn't pay for a life versus a life. What's understood to be a lengthy sentence and what is acceptable is defined by the polity, and it's defined by the culture. Other countries have defined it as unacceptable to use capital punishment. So that's what we debate as a society.
Yeah,
and now we have decided that like in my state, life means life. You are committed, guilty of first or second degree murder, you will die behind bars most likely.
And what is it about American society that is now apparently feeding this? This is not just the politicians. According to your book, this is also part of American culture. That it isn't the politicians are merely responding. Because you call your book "The Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics," and it's true that it's a political decision that's being made, but it's feeding the needs of the people that are doing the voting, isn't it? And
right.
and what I'm fascinated about is that it isn't just the politicians that are saying it; they're saying it, of course, and then they're getting voted for because people are responding to this kind of talk.
Right, but it's a question of whether the politicians lead public opinion, or do the politicians just reflect public opinion? And I argue in the book that politicians largely feed public opinion. It's surprising to me how many public talks I give, classes I teach. Many Americans just don't know these basic facts about mass incarceration.
No, they don't.
When I tell them that we incarcerate people at 720, 730 per 100,000 people, and this is tops in the world, higher than Russia, higher than China, both in absolute terms and in proportional terms. This is a country of more than 1 billion people. And when I tell them about if you're young black male born today, you have a 1 in 3 chance of spending time in prison. People are stunned. In many cases, people just don't know. And when I tell people about the huge population that we have serving solitary confinement, that some people are serving decades, locked in a cell, 23 hours a day, no human contact, for years on end, serve their food through a slot in the door. People say, "No, this can't be America. You must be making this up." So in some ways, I think people just don't know. And one of the things which we haven't talked about, we talk about mass incarceration being a quantitative phenomenon, that there's so many people who are locked up. But the other piece of it is that our prisons and jails are very dehumanizing, degrading institutions, much more so than in other developed countries. So it's not only the quantity of people that we lock up, but it's also the lack of dignity in the conditions that they face when they are incarcerated.
Well, we're about to go to a break here, Professor, and you mentioned, and when we come back from the break, you mentioned Europe. You also mentioned somewhere in your book de Tocqueville. I think for a lot of us, we remember our I guess, high school. Everybody had to read this required reading de Tocqueville's Democracy in America from 1830, a European coming over and exploring democracy in America. And he first was coming over here to explore our prison system. And I didn't realize that until I was reading your book. I guess it's been a while since I had studied de Tocqueville. And he was fascinated by the horrible, degrading, dehumanizing American prisons even of the 1830s. Isn't that right?
That's correct. That's correct. And seeing the solitary confinement that was used here, actually in Philadelphia, that invented the penitentiary.
Right. So when we come back from the break here, and we got some news and everything else, I'd like to talk about a little bit about the prisons themselves.
Okay.
The dehumanizing aspects of them, the fact that they're really not rehabilitation places at all. In fact, when people go to the prison, they actually, you're the expert. I'm going to ask you about that sort of thing when we come back. For those of you who just joined us, it's Justice for All with Professor Marie Gottschalk. Please stick around and listen to the next hour. We'll be right back.